August 16, 1944. A lone American captain sprints across open cobblestones toward the most famous cathedral in France. Rifle fire echoes off 800-year-old stone walls. He does not stop. He does not call for backup. He runs straight through the cathedral doors alone into the darkness because somewhere inside those walls, German engineers have wired enough explosive charges to bring the whole magnificent structure down on top of the advancing American army. His name is Captain Wellborn Barton Griffith, Jr. He is 33 years old. He is from Quanah, Texas. He has a wife at home and a baby daughter he has never held. And in the next 4 minutes he is going to climb alone into the bell tower of the Cathedral of Chartres, find the German detonation wires, and cut every single one of them. The cathedral will stand. Captain Griffith will not come back down alive. And 291 Americans died to take this city. And 3 weeks later, a French colonel in a freshly pressed uniform is going to walk into the American garrison and tell the commanding officer that Chartres now belongs to France, that the liberation should be credited to French forces, that the Americans should clear out within 72 hours. And the man who hears about that, the man who gets in a jeep and drives 86 miles at full speed to answer that insult personally, is a general so volcanic, so incandescent, so absolutely incapable of diplomatic silence, that the United States War Department has classified his temper as a national security risk. Before we go any further, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this story goes places the textbooks never followed. Join our community as we dig into the moments history tried to bury the confrontations, the cover-ups, the words generals spoke when they thought the cameras were off. Like this video, if you believe these forgotten voices still deserve to be heard. What General Patton said in that prefecture building on September 1, 1944, was struck from 3 official records redacted from 2 memoirs and whispered for the next 60 years by every American officer who was in the room. The French government still will not release the report. The full account sat sealed in a private archive until 2003. And when it finally came out, it contained 14 minutes and 41 seconds of the most extraordinary speech any American general ever delivered to an Allied officer on European soil. 14 minutes that shaped the borders of post-war Europe. 14 minutes that Charles de Gaulle never acknowledged, never answered, and never forgot. But to understand what Patton said, you have to understand what Patton saw. And to understand what Patton saw, you have to go back 3 weeks earlier to the afternoon of August 16, 1944, to a city of pale limestone and rose windows and ancient stone where the war arrived like a thunderclap and left a bill that no diplomat was ever willing to pay. By the 3rd week of August 1944, the Allied campaign in France had stopped resembling a conventional military operation and had started resembling a controlled avalanche. Operation Cobra, the breakout from the hedgerows of Normandy, had ruptured the German front on July 25th, and within 20 days, General Patton's 3rd United States Army had swept across 200 miles of French countryside in a movement so fast that supply officers were filling fuel cans by hand, and drivers were falling asleep at the wheel and waking up in villages whose names they could not pronounce. The historian Carlo d'Este would later write that no army in modern history had advanced so far so fast with so little rest. The Germans were not simply retreating, they were dissolving. Entire divisions were being cut off, surrounded, reduced to isolated pockets of resistance, fighting from church towers and farmhouses and crossroads that the American maps had not yet marked. The 7th Armored Division and the 5th Infantry Division of Patton's 3rd Army were pushing hard through the Loire Valley, and the city of Chartres, ancient capital of the Eure-et-Loire department, home to the greatest surviving Gothic cathedral in the world, sat directly in their path. The German garrison in Chartres numbered approximately 2,000 men. They had been ordered to hold. They had been told that a counterattack was coming, that the front would stabilize, that they would not be abandoned. They were told what all surrounded garrisons in a collapsing war are told, and the men who told them knew it was not true. What the German commanders knew that the garrison did not was that Wehrmacht Army Group B was already planning the destruction of everything in the city of military value before the Americans arrived. The cathedral was on the list. It had been on the list for reasons that combined military utility with a peculiar kind of spite. The twin spires of Chartres Cathedral rise to a height of 113 meters. From the bell tower on a clear August afternoon, a German observer could see 30 kilometers in every direction. The advancing American armor was visible from miles away. The cathedral was in the blunt arithmetic of military necessity, an observation post and a fire direction center, and under the laws of war as practiced on the Western Front in 1944, that made it a legitimate military target. The German engineers had done their work carefully. The charges were set not to bring the towers down, but to compromise the structure sufficiently to deny the Americans the advantage of the height, while ensuring that the rubble would block the main approach roads into the city center. It was, in the cold language of demolitions, an elegant solution. What it was in any other language was the destruction of an 800-year-old building that had survived the 100 Years' War, the French Revolution, and 2 previous world wars. The windows, the famous rose windows of Chartres, had already been removed by French volunteers and stored in the countryside, a precaution taken in 1939, when it became clear that another war was coming. The stone, the vaults, the carved portals, the Black Madonna and the relics, and the labyrinth worn smooth by centuries of pilgrims' feet, none of that could be moved. All of it would come down with the charges. The 7th Armored reached the outskirts of Chartres on the morning of August 15th. The fighting in the streets was savage and confused. Snipers in upper windows, German machine gun positions in the old market square, artillery fire coming in from the eastern ridgeline that the Americans had not yet turned. By nightfall on the 15th, the situation inside the city was still unresolved, and the German engineers still had their hand on the detonator, and the cathedral was still standing. And nobody in the American command structure knew for certain where the demolition team was or when they intended to fire the charges. And Captain Wellborn Barton Griffith Jr. knew, or rather Captain Griffith had been told by a French resistance fighter, a man named only as Maurice, in the after-action report, that the German demolitions team was positioned somewhere in the North Tower, and that they had been given orders to fire no later than dawn on August 16th, when it became clear the city was lost. Griffith took this information to his battalion commander. His battalion commander told him to wait for clearance. Griffith waited 40 minutes, then he stopped waiting. What happened next is documented in 4 separate after-action reports, a commendation citation that was never formally processed, and the sworn oral testimony of 2 French witnesses given to the United States Army Military History Institute in 1969. Captain Griffith, armed with a rifle and a sidearm, and accompanied by no one, because he had not asked anyone to come with him, and no one had volunteered without being asked, crossed 300 meters of open ground under intermittent fire, entered the cathedral through the south portal, located the primary detonation line running up the interior wall of the North Tower, and climbed. The German demolitions team heard him coming. They did not wait. The explosion that killed Captain Wellborn Griffith Jr. on the morning of August 16, 1944, was not the main charge. It was a secondary device, a booby trap set against exactly the kind of interference he was providing, positioned on the 3rd landing of the bell tower staircase. The main charge was never fired. The demolitions team, with their officer down, and Americans now pouring into the cathedral from multiple directions, abandoned their position and attempted to withdraw through the city. Most of them were captured within the hour. The cathedral stood, every stone of it, every vault and window and carved portal and piece of 800-year-old floor. It stood because a man from Quanah, Texas, decided that waiting for clearance was less important than the building still being there when clearance arrived. Captain Griffith's body was recovered from the tower staircase on the morning of August 16th. He was 33 years old. He had a wife named Willie. He had a daughter, Carolyn, who was 6 weeks old when he shipped out, and whom he had never held. The casualty report listed him as killed in action during the clearance of Chartres. The commendation citation, as noted, was never formally processed. He was buried in a temporary cemetery 4 miles east of the city. His body was repatriated to Quanah, Texas, in 1948. His daughter became a schoolteacher. In 1954, the citizens of Chartres, collecting centimes from their own pockets, because no government paid for it, erected a small bronze plaque on the cathedral to the American officer who had run alone into the bell tower to save the windows. The plaque is still there. It is small. It is easy to miss.
Bow.
291 Americans became casualties in the battle for Chartres. 291. Not abstractions, not statistics. Men from Georgia and Iowa and Pennsylvania and Texas who had been eating cold rations and sleeping in hedgerows and writing letters home since June 6th. Men who were now dead or wounded in a French city they had never heard of 6 months earlier, for a reason that had seemed clear enough at the time, and was about to be made extremely complicated by a delegation arriving from Paris. George Smith Patton, Jr. was not a man who processed injustice quietly. He was not built for it. He was built for the opposite. He was 59 years old in the summer of 1944, a cavalry officer by training and temperament, a man who had competed in the modern pentathlon at the 1912 Olympics, who had chased Pancho Villa across northern Mexico in 1916, who had commanded tanks in the Meuse-Argonne offensive in 1918 and been wounded and decorated and promoted and passed over and nearly destroyed by his own mouth more times than his career could reasonably survive. He wore ivory-handled revolvers, not because he was performing, but because he genuinely believed that a general who looked like he was winning made his men believe they were winning, and men who believed they were winning generally did. He was theatrical, and he was profane, and he was occasionally brilliant, and he was always paying attention to who was getting credit for what. He had known for weeks that something was wrong with the mathematics of the liberation. He had read the dispatches from Paris. He had read de Gaulle's speech of August 25th, the great cathedral speech, Paris outraged, Paris broken, Paris martyred, but Paris liberated. He had read it twice. He had noted with the precision of a man who counts things that in 12 minutes of remarks delivered from the balcony of the Hôtel de Ville on the day the city was freed, the general leading the Free French forces had not found time to mention the United States of America by name. Not once. Not the 4th Infantry Division taking sniper fire on the eastern boulevards at the very moment de Gaulle was speaking. Not the 20,000 American soldiers ordered to remain on the outskirts so that French troops could enter first for the photographs. Not the American tanks. Not the American fuel. Not the American blood. Patton wrote in his diary that night, in the longer unredacted version that sat sealed in the Library of Congress until 1996, that the Frog General thinks he has liberated his own country. Someone needs to remind him whose blood is on the cobblestones. He was composing the reminder. He did not yet know exactly where he would deliver it. The universe was about to provide a location. On September 1st, 1944, a French colonel in a freshly pressed uniform arrived in Chartres. He presented himself to Colonel John Donahue of the 5th Infantry Division, the American garrison commander, a 46-year-old Pennsylvanian who had personally watched 83 of his men die in the fight for this city 2 weeks earlier. The French colonel's name was Henri Dupuy of the Free French 2nd Bureau. He informed Colonel Donahue that the city of Chartres was, by order of the Provisional Government of the French Republic, now under French military and civil jurisdiction. He informed him that the United States Army was requested to withdraw its garrison to a perimeter outside the city limits within 72 hours. He informed him that the official record of the city's liberation would be amended to reflect the role of French and Allied forces operating under unified French command. Colonel Donahue did not respond. He picked up the telephone. He called 3rd Army headquarters. He asked for Patton. 90 minutes later, a jeep came up the road from the east at speed. In the passenger seat was Colonel Charles Codman of Boston Patton's aide, 48 years old, a wine importer in civilian life, and a veteran of the First World War who had flown with Eddie Rickenbacker. At the wheel was Sergeant John Mims of Abbeville, Alabama, who had been Patton's personal driver since March and who would write to his wife Mary Lou that night, drove the old man to a French town where some kind of fight was going on between him and a French officer. When he came out, his face was not red. That means it was the bad kind of mad. The bad kind of mad walked up the marble staircase of the prefecture of Chartres, 2 steps at a time, passed through the antechamber without stopping, and pushed open the door to the prefect's office without knocking. Inside the room were a French colonel, 2 French lieutenants, and a civilian representative of the Interior Ministry. Codman, who entered behind Patton and remained at the doorway, timed what happened next on his watch. He would record the time in a private memorandum sealed until 2003. 14 minutes, 41 seconds. What Patton said in those 14 minutes, every word of it, is coming in part 2. And when you hear it, you will understand why Charles de Gaulle never wrote a single word about Chartres in his 3-volume war memoirs. You will understand why the French government still refuses to declassify the report filed by the colonel who was in that room. And you will understand why a dying general in a hospital bed in Heidelberg 4 days before Christmas, 1945, with a broken neck and a borrowed future, and a nurse changing his IV drip, said into the empty air of the room the boys at Chartres knew. And someday, someone will know. And part 2 begins where this story gets dangerous. In part 1, we watched Captain Wellborn Griffith die alone in a bell tower to save a cathedral. We watched 291 Americans bleed for a city called Chartres, and we watched George Patton climb into a jeep and drive 86 miles at full speed toward a confrontation that 3 governments would spend the next 60 years trying to erase from the record. He arrived at the prefecture. He pushed open the door. Codman started his watch. 14 minutes and 41 seconds. That is what history got. That is what Paris got. That is what Charles de Gaulle got, whether he wanted it or not. But here is what nobody tells you about that room. There were 4 men inside when Patton entered. By the time he left, not one of them would ever speak about it publicly. Not the colonel, not the lieutenants, not the civilian from the Interior Ministry. The French government would classify the after-action report within 72 hours of its filing. And in Washington, a single State Department telegram would reference the incident in language so carefully laundered that you have to know exactly what you are reading to understand what it means. 4 governments, 60 years, 1 room. And now we go inside. Colonel Henri Dupuy of the Free French Second Bureau was not an incompetent man. That is important to understand. He was not a fool sent on a fool's errand by people who did not know better. He was a career intelligence officer fluent in 3 languages, a veteran of the resistance networks in occupied France, a man who had survived the war by being precise and careful and politically attuned in ways that most soldiers never have to be. He had been given a specific order by a specific chain of command, and he had carried it out exactly as instructed. He had presented his credentials to Colonel Donahue. He had stated the provisional government's position clearly and without hostility. He had even, by his own account in the classified report, filed 3 days later, attempted to frame the transfer of jurisdiction as a mutually beneficial administrative arrangement designed to free American forces for continued operations to the east. He had not expected Patton. Nobody ever expected Patton in the way that Patton actually arrived, which was nothing like the version of Patton that official communiques described, and everything like the version that his own men whispered about in the dark. Colonel Codman, standing at the doorway with his watch already running, would write in his 1947 memorandum that the room smelled of cologne and cigarette smoke, and a kind of arrogance I had only previously encountered in the German officer corps. He wrote that Patton walked to the center of the room, placed both fists on the mahogany desk, and looked at Dupuy for what Codman timed as an unbroken 8 seconds of silence. During those 8 seconds, Codman wrote, the French colonel's face changed color twice. Then Patton spoke. He spoke in English, deliberately slowly, because he wanted every word to land and stay landed. Colonel, he said, I am told you have informed an American officer that this city now belongs to France. Dupuy began to answer. He began with the legal framework of the provisional government's authority over liberated French territory, the established precedents under international law, the courteous and collaborative nature of the request, the long-standing partnership between American and French forces that both governments were committed to honoring. He had prepared this answer. It was a good answer. It was the answer a careful man prepares when he knows the meeting will be difficult. Patton raised his right hand. Not high, just enough. Dupuy stopped talking. I am going to say something to you, Patton said, and I am going to say at once. and I am going to ask you to carry it back to General de Gaulle exactly as I say it. Do you understand?" Dupuy nodded. "This city," Patton said, "was liberated by the 7th Armored Division and the 5th Infantry Division of the 3rd United States Army on the 16th of August. 291 American soldiers became casualties in the taking of this city. 23 of them are buried in a temporary cemetery 4 miles east of where you are standing right now." He paused. The pause was not theatrical. It was the pause of a man locating a specific fact inside himself and placing it precisely where it needs to go. One of them, Captain Wellborn Griffith of Texas, climbed alone into the bell tower of the cathedral, which you can see from this window, to make sure that we would not have to destroy a building that has stood for 800 years. Captain Griffith was 33 years old. He had a wife. He had a daughter who was 6 weeks old when he last saw her. He never saw her again. The room did not move. Codman at the doorway wrote later that he had the distinct sensation of watching a man who had been rehearsing this speech since August 25th, since the morning he read de Gaulle's speech by kerosene lamp, and went very still and very quiet in a way that was not stillness, but compression. "Now you," Patton continued, his voice dropping half a register, "in a uniform paid for by the American taxpayer, carrying a sidearm manufactured in Springfield, Massachusetts, driven here in a Dodge truck built in Detroit, fed on rations grown in Kansas, are standing in a building liberated by American boys, and telling me that this city is now French." He leaned forward. The distance between his face and Dupuy's face across the mahogany desk was by Codman's estimate approximately 18 inches. "Colonel, this city is American. Every stone of it, every cobblestone, every roof tile, every window. It was bought and paid for in American blood, in American currency, that does not get refunded. I do not give a goddamn what your provisional government says. I do not give a goddamn what General de Gaulle says. You can have it back when I leave. You will not have it 1 minute before." Dupuy opened his mouth. He closed it. Patton was not finished. "You will tell General de Gaulle that the next time a Frenchman in an American uniform driving an American vehicle informs an American officer that an American liberated town is being transferred to French jurisdiction, I will personally come to wherever that Frenchman is standing, and I will personally remove him from that town, and I will do so with the same lack of ceremony with which I would remove a German prisoner from my mess tent. Do you understand me, Colonel?" Dupuy said in English, "Yes, General, I understand." "You will further tell General de Gaulle that I have read his speech of August 25th. I have read it twice. I noticed that in 12 minutes of remarks delivered from the balcony of the Hotel de Ville, the General did not find time to mention the United States of America by name. He did not find time to mention the soldiers who fought their way from a beach in Normandy through 11 weeks of hedgerows so that he could stand on that balcony." Patton straightened. He pulled his jacket flat with both hands, the small automatic gesture of a man who has said what he came to say and is now preparing to leave. "Tell him I noticed. Tell him that history is going to notice too." And then, in what every witness would later describe as the strangest moment in an encounter, full of strange moments, Patton smiled. It was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of a man who has settled an account inside himself and no longer needs to carry the balance. He turned. He walked out. Codman stopped the watch. 14 minutes. 41 seconds.
Bien.
On the marble staircase halfway down, Patton stopped. He turned to Codman and said in a voice low enough that only Codman heard it, "Charlie, that man is going to be writing memoirs in 20 years. Make sure I am not in them, or if I am, make sure I am at my worst." Codman wrote it down that evening in the small leather notebook he kept for Patton's verbatim utterances. Then Patton walked out into the September sunlight, climbed back into the Jeep, and told Sergeant Mims to drive him back to the front, where there was still a war to win. In the prefecture behind him, Colonel Henri Dupuy stood without speaking for several minutes. Then he sat in the prefect's chair. Then he stood up again. Then he asked one of his lieutenants for a glass of water. The 72-hour ultimatum was never mentioned again. The amendment to the official liberation record was never filed. By nightfall on September 1st, the request to transfer jurisdiction had been quietly withdrawn through French liaison channels. Colonel Donohue's garrison remained in Chartres until October 3rd, when, by mutual agreement at the army group level, French civil authorities formally took possession of the prefecture in a small ceremony with both flags flying side by side. The official record says the incident never happened. 3 documents say otherwise. The Third Army War Diary for September 1st, 1944 contains one line for the period between 1100 and 1230 hours. Commanding General absent from headquarters location Chartres returned 1245. That is all. But Codman's memorandum, 11 pages in his precise Boston hand, was drafted in 1947 and held in the archives of the Boston Athenaeum, sealed by his estate, not available to historians until 2003. When his daughter asked him in 1962 why he had left the Chartres incident out of his published memoir, Drive, released in 1957, Codman said, "Because the general asked me not to, and because the French still have feelings about it, and because I will be dead before they forget." He was right about 2 of those 3 things. Sergeant Mims never spoke about it publicly. His standard answer in every interview, preserved on tape at the United States Army Heritage and Education Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, was, "I drove the general to a lot of places. I didn't always know why." He did, though. But in the letter to his wife Mary Lou, written September 2, 1944, Mims was less careful. "Drove the old man yesterday to a French town where some kind of fight was going on between him and a French officer. I waited outside. When he came out, his face was not red. That means it was the bad kind of mad. He did not speak to me the whole way back. We are still fighting Germans, Mary Lou. I don't know why we are fighting the French." The letter is at Auburn University. It was deposited there by the Mims family in 1998. The third document is a State Department telegram dated September 24, 1944, declassified in 1978, and filed under reference number RG59.85 1.0092444. It reads in the language of men paid to say difficult things without saying them. General de Gaulle has communicated through indirect channels his strong displeasure at recent expressions by senior American field commanders regarding French post-war territorial and administrative claims in liberated zones. He requests through these channels that the personal authority of the Supreme Commander be exercised to ensure such expressions are not repeated. There was only one senior American field commander in September 1944 capable of producing that kind of telegram through that kind of channel. There was only one Patton. Eisenhower received the complaint. He filed it. He told no one. He never raised it with Patton. He understood with the political instincts that would eventually carry him to the White House that some lines cannot be uncrossed without breaking what was built. He let it lie. He was good at letting things lie. It was one of the essential skills of his career, but Patton could not let it lie. In December 1944, at a private dinner in his headquarters at Nancy attended by Codman and Major General Hugh Gaffey and a visiting senator whose name Codman redacted, Patton said the following, which Codman transcribed verbatim. "The French general I spoke to in Chartres will not write about me, and I will not write about him, and we will both die before this is properly told. But I will tell you something, gentlemen. Charles de Gaulle is a man who believes France belongs to him. I am a man who believes the United States belongs to no one. That is why we will never understand each other, and that is why the next century will be difficult." He was right about the next century. In 1966, de Gaulle pulled France out of NATO's integrated military command. He vetoed British entry into the European Economic Community twice. He refused American basing rights. He maintained, until his death in 1970, a posture toward the United States that historians have described, depending on their nationality, as principled or ungrateful, or both simultaneously. He wrote 3 volumes of war memoirs. He did not write a single word about Chartres. He did not write a single word about Patton at all. The omission is in its way the loudest thing he ever said. On December 9, 1945, on a road outside Mannheim, Germany, Patton's staff car collided at low speed with a military truck. His neck broke. He was paralyzed. He was taken to the 131st Station Hospital in Heidelberg. He had 12 days. In those 12 days between morphine and pain, and the visits of his wife Beatrice, who had flown in from Boston, he talked. He talked about Russia. He talked about a war he believed was already inevitable. And on December 17th, 4 days before his death, a nurse named Anne-Marie Krimmel of Pennsylvania, 26 years old, was changing his IV drip when Patton said to no one in the room, and to everyone in it, the Frog General won. He got his country back. He never said thank you. But the boys at Chartres knew. And I knew. And someday, someone will know. Nurse Krimmel wrote it in her diary that night. The diary was donated to the Eisenhower Presidential Library in 2007. Her voice in the oral history recorded by the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress in 2002, when she was 83 years old, is completely steady. He was talking to himself, she said. But I was the only one in the room. So in a way, he was telling me. I think he wanted somebody to write it down. In 2014, a French historian named Olivier Viaviorca, working in the archives of the French Ministry of Defense, found a single sheet of paper in a folder marked simply Chartres, September 1944. It was a handwritten draft, apparently never sent, written by General Pierre Koenig and addressed to Charles de Gaulle. The final paragraph reads in translation, Mon Général, the American Patton is a barbarian in the manner of a Visigoth, but he is also in a way I find I cannot dismiss correct. We are taking too much. We are thanking too little. History will not be kind to us if we do not at some point say what should be said. I ask your guidance on this matter. There is no record of a reply. The principle that George Patton defended in a 14-minute conversation in the prefecture of Chartres on September 1, 1944, was not about France. It was not about credit or pride or flags or photographs. It was about something older and harder and more universal than any of those things. The simple, unfashionable, often inconvenient idea that the cost of a thing is paid by the people who pay it. That gratitude is not a weakness, but a foundation. That nations like men are measured by what they are willing to say out loud when no one is watching. Patton said it. De Gaulle did not. And on a marble staircase in a French town on a September afternoon, with the smell of cordite still on his uniform and 291 names carried in his memory, like a debt that no diplomat was willing to acknowledge. An American general drew a line that no president would have drawn, that no politician could afford to draw. He drew it for the dead. And the dead who have no other voice will speak through that line for as long as men remember why nations bleed for one another, and what is owed and what is forgotten, and what somewhere by someone must always finally be said. In Part 1, Captain Wellborn Griffith died alone in a bell tower to save a cathedral and 291 Americans paid in blood for a city called Chartres. In Part 2, George Patton drove 86 miles to stand across a mahogany desk from a French colonel and deliver 14 minutes and 41 seconds of the most undiplomatic speech any American general ever gave to an Allied officer. The 72-hour ultimatum evaporated. The French withdrawal request disappeared through liaison channels. The official record said it never happened. 3 documents said otherwise. But here is what the documents could not contain. Word travels. It travels through jeep drivers and radio operators and liaison officers and the particular informal telegraph of men who have been living in close quarters for 11 weeks and have nothing to talk about except what just happened and what is going to happen next. By September 3, 1944, every senior French officer in the Paris theater knew that Patton had gone to Chartres. By September 5th, de Gaulle knew the substance of what had been said. And by September 10th, the implications of that 14-minute conversation were rippling outward in ways that neither Patton nor de Gaulle nor Eisenhower nor anyone else in a command tent on the Western Front had fully calculated. And because what Patton had done in Chartres was not simply defend the honor of 291 dead Americans. He had drawn a line across the entire question of post-war France. He had said in language that no diplomat would have used, and no politician could have survived using, that the cost of liberation was a matter of fact and not of narrative. That the men who bled for a thing owned it in a way that speeches and flags and provisional governments did not, and that someone was going to keep the accounting whether the accountants were welcome or not. That line did not disappear when he climbed back into the jeep. It hardened. Monse, the French response came through channels so indirect that it took American intelligence analysts 3 weeks to assemble the full picture. De Gaulle did not confront Eisenhower directly. He was too careful for that, and he understood too well that a direct confrontation over Chartres would require him to acknowledge that Chartres had happened, which would require him to acknowledge what was said in Chartres, which was the one thing he was not prepared to do. Instead, the Free French Second Bureau began a quiet and methodical effort to establish French administrative precedents in every liberated city along the American line of advance, simultaneously reasoning that if the transfers happened fast enough and in enough places at once, no single general could drive to all of them. Between September 3rd and September 18th, 1944, French administrative delegations arrived in 11 cities along the Third Army's operational zone: Orléans, Tours, Le Mans, Laval, Alençon. Each delegation carried the same documentation, the same legal framework, the same request for American garrison withdrawal within a specified period. Each delegation had been briefed by someone who had read Dupuy's classified report or been told its contents not to be in the room alone with Patton. The instruction was sensible. It was also in its way a concession, because the very fact that French officers were now being briefed on how to avoid a specific American general in a specific emotional state was an acknowledgement that the general's emotional state carried strategic weight. De Gaulle was adjusting his operations around the existence of a man he refused to acknowledge. That is not the behavior of someone who believes the argument is already won. The 11 delegations achieved mixed results. In 4 cities, American garrison commanders accepted the French administrative framework and began coordination for transfer. In 3 cities, the process stalled in paperwork and jurisdictional ambiguity. In 4 cities, the American commanders called Third Army headquarters and asked in varying degrees of directness whether General Patton had any guidance on the matter. Third Army headquarters on each occasion told them that the commanding general was unavailable and that they should use their best judgment. This was not accidental. Patton had made himself strategically unavailable on the specific question of French administrative transfers, because he understood that his intervention in Chartres had created a precedent he could not repeat 11 times without triggering the kind of formal diplomatic crisis that would bring Eisenhower down on him with both hands. And he had made his point once. He had made it in a room with 4 witnesses and a watch running. He did not need to make it again. He needed the point to make itself. It did. On September 14, 1944, a French administrative delegation arrived in the city of Le Mans, which had been liberated by the 5th Armored Division and elements of the 79th Infantry Division on August 8th at a cost of 178 American casualties. The delegation was led by a French lieutenant colonel named Bertrand Mercier, who had read the briefing notes carefully and was prepared for difficulty. What he was not prepared for was Colonel William Wainwright of the 79th Infantry, a 43-year-old Ohioan, who had not read the briefing notes because no one had sent them to him, and who greeted the French delegation in the courtyard of the prefecture with a handshake and a simple question. He asked Mercier how many French soldiers had died taking Le Mans. Mercier did not answer. He could not answer because the honest answer was none, and they both knew it, and the question had been asked in front of 6 American enlisted men and 2 French lieutenants, and the silence that followed it lasted long enough to become a different kind of answer. Mercier filed his report to Paris 3 days later. The Le Mans transfer request was quietly withdrawn on September 19th. Wainwright had never heard of Chartres. He had simply asked the obvious question, which is sometimes the most devastating question available. By the end of September 1944, the pattern had clarified. The French administrative push had achieved partial success in cities where the American garrison commanders were either indifferent to the credit question or eager to be relieved of occupation duty. It had failed completely in cities where the commanders had been paying attention to what their men had gone through to take the place. The dividing line was not rank or education or political sophistication. It was whether the man in charge had watched his soldiers die for the city he was now being asked to hand over. Men who had watched that tended to ask Wainwright's question. Men who had not tended to sign the paperwork. This was the real consequence of Chartres. Not the 14 minutes themselves, not the specific words delivered to a specific colonel across a specific desk, but the permission structure that those 14 minutes created. Patton had demonstrated that the question could be asked, that it was legitimate to ask it, that an American officer of any rank could look at a French administrative claim and say simply and without hostility, "How many of yours died here, and what does that entitle you to?" The question was not aggressive. It was not hostile. It was arithmetic. And once it had been asked once by a 3-star general in full uniform with ivory-handled revolvers and 86 miles of road behind him, it could be asked by a colonel in Ohio fatigues in a courtyard in Le Mans, and the arithmetic came out the same either way. De Gaulle understood this. His memoirs, written in the 1950s and published in 3 volumes between 1954 and 1959, cover the liberation of France in considerable detail. They describe the entry into Paris, the speech at the Hôtel de Ville, the delirious crowds, the sniper fire, the establishment of the provisional government. They describe Leclerc and Koenig, and the fighters of the interior resistance. They describe Eisenhower and Churchill and Roosevelt and the complex diplomacy of coalition warfare. They do not describe Chartres. They do not describe Patton at all. In 3 volumes covering the period in which Patton's Third Army liberated more French territory than any other Allied formation, the name George Smith Patton, Jr. does not appear once. The historian Jean-Louis Crémieux-Brilhac, writing in 1996, called this the most consequential omission in 20th century French political literature. He was not exaggerating, because the omission was not ignorance. De Gaulle knew who Patton was. He knew what Patton had done in Chartres. He knew about the September administrative push and its partial failure. He knew about Wainwright's question in Le Mans. He had received Koenig's draft note, the one that called Patton a Visigoth and then admitted he was correct, even if there is no record that he replied to it. He knew all of it, and he chose with the deliberate precision of a man who understood that history is written by those who control the narrative to write none of it. That choice had consequences that outlasted the war by decades. Because the French public narrative of the liberation built on de Gaulle's memoirs and the official histories commissioned by the provisional government did not include the arithmetic. It did not include the question of who died where and what that cost and what was owed. It included the flags and the speeches and the crowds on the Champs-Élysées and the tricolor rising over the Hôtel de Crillon. It was a beautiful narrative. It was incomplete in a specific way that a specific 14-minute conversation in a specific prefecture building had tried to correct. In December 1944, at the private dinner in Nancy, Patton said to the unnamed senator and to Codman and to Gaffey, "Charles de Gaulle is a man who believes France belongs to him. I am a man who believes the United States belongs to no one. That is why we will never understand each other. And that is why the next century will be difficult." He was speaking in the abstract. He was also speaking with the precision of a man who had spent 4 months watching the gap between what was done and what was acknowledged widen into something that diplomatic language could no longer bridge. The next century was difficult in exactly the ways he described. In 1966, de Gaulle pulled France out of NATO's integrated military command, a decision that forced the relocation of NATO headquarters from Paris to Brussels and required the United States to dismantle 14 air bases and 29 military installations on French soil. He vetoed British entry into the European Economic Community in 1963 and again in 1967, partly on the grounds that Britain was too closely tied to American influence to be a genuinely European partner. He refused American requests for basing rights during the 1973 Middle East conflict. He maintained until his death in November 1970 a posture toward the United States that was architecturally built on the proposition that France owed America nothing that France had not already paid in full. And yet, in 2014, in the archives of the French Ministry of Defense, Olivier Wiviorca found Koenig's draft note. In 2003, Codman's memorandum became available to researchers. In 2007, Anne-Marie Krimmel donated her diary to the Eisenhower Presidential Library. In 1996, the full unredacted Patton diary entries for August and September 1944 were released from the Library of Congress. The archive was assembling piece by piece the record that the official histories had left out. Koenig had written, "We are taking too much, we are thanking too little." He had asked de Gaulle for guidance. There is no record of a reply. But the fact that a French general wrote those words in September 1944 means that the arithmetic was visible to people on both sides of the mahogany desk. It means the question was not only Patton's question. It was a question the situation itself was asking, and it was asking it in a language that did not require translation. The plaque on the Cathedral of Chartres is still there. Small, easy to miss. The people of the city paid for it themselves in centimes in 1954 because no government paid for it. It commemorates the American officer who ran alone into the bell tower. It does not mention Patton. It does not mention de Gaulle. It mentions the man from Texas who climbed the stairs and did not come back down. And it does so in French and English side by side, because the people of Chartres understood something that neither government was willing to put in its official record. That the cost of a thing is carried by the people who carry it. That the carrying does not disappear because the speeches do not mention it. That stone remembers what paper forgets. George Patton died on December 21, 1945, 12 days after a low-speed collision on a road outside Mannheim broke his neck. He was buried at the American Military Cemetery in Hamm, Luxembourg, among the men of the Third Army, which is where he asked to be buried. De Gaulle outlived him by 25 years and died in Colombe-les-Deux-Églises on November 9, 1970, sitting in a chair watching the evening news. He was 79 years old. He had spent the last 4 years of his life writing the third volume of his memoirs. It covers the liberation of France in 412 pages. Patton is not in them. But the next chapter of this story, the one that almost no one knows, is not about what either man wrote. It is about what they left behind. It is about a daughter in Texas who grew up to be a schoolteacher and never met her father. It is about a nurse in Pennsylvania who kept a diary for 60 years because a dying general asked her in a way to write it down. It is about the specific weight of gratitude when it is withheld, and the specific weight of principle when it is paid at cost, and the question that sits underneath all of it, the question that Wainwright asked in a courtyard in Le Mans without knowing he was echoing anything, the question that is still in a way waiting for an answer. What exactly do we owe the dead? And who decides when the debt is paid? That is part 4. And it goes somewhere the first 3 parts have only been pointing toward. And in 3 parts we have followed a story that 4 governments spent 60 years trying to keep out of the record. We watched Captain Wellborn Griffith die in a bell tower to save a cathedral. We watched 291 Americans pay the price for a city called Chartres. We watched George Patton drive 86 miles to stand across a mahogany desk and say in 14 minutes and 41 seconds what no diplomat would say and no politician could survive saying. And we watched the consequences of those 14 minutes ripple outward through 11 French cities, through a lieutenant colonel's question in a courtyard in Le Mans, through a draft letter that a French general wrote and apparently never sent through decades of NATO politics and European vetoes, and the careful silence of 3 volumes of French memoirs. But the cliffhanger at the end of part 3 was not about any of that. It was about a simpler and harder question. What happened to the people? What happened to the nurse who wrote it down? To the driver who waited outside? To the daughter in Texas who grew up without a father? To the general himself? Broken-necked in a hospital bed in Heidelberg with 12 days left and a borrowed future. What does a story like this cost the people inside it, and what exactly does it leave behind? George Smith. Patton Jr. died on December 21, 1945, at 5:55 in the evening in the 130th Station Hospital in Heidelberg, Germany. The cause was pulmonary embolism, a blood clot that formed in the wreckage of a neck broken 12 days earlier, when a low-speed collision on a road outside Mannheim threw him forward in his staff car. He was 60 years old. The war in Europe had been over for 7 months. The war in the Pacific had been over for 4. He had spent those 7 months commanding the 15th Army, a largely administrative formation tasked with writing the history of the European campaign, which was either a profound irony or a deliberate punishment, depending on which account you read and how much you trust the people who arranged it. He had not wanted the 15th Army. He had wanted to go to the Pacific. He had wanted to fight the Japanese, and when that was refused, he had wanted to go to China, and when that was refused, he had wanted to go home and run for Senate from California, and when that was being considered, he had given an interview in which he compared denazification policy to American political party rivalry and created a scandal that ended his command of the Third Army in October 1945 and placed him in the 15th, where he spent his remaining weeks dictating memoirs to an aide and reading his own press clippings with the expression of a man who has outlived the thing that made him useful. He was not happy in peace. He had never been designed for it. His wife Beatrice, who had known him since they were children in Massachusetts, and who had spent 30 years married to the loudest man in any room. He entered, flew to Heidelberg when she heard about the accident, and sat with him through the 12 days. She was with him when he died. She brought his body home to the United States on a military transport, and then, after consulting with the War Department, had him buried in Luxembourg at the American Military Cemetery at Ham, among the men of the Third Army, which is where he had asked to be. 12,522 American soldiers are buried at Ham. He is buried with them in the same ground under the same white cross, distinguished only by his rank insignia on the marker. It is by any measure the right place for him. Beatrice Patton spent the years after the war editing his diaries for publication. The version that appeared in 1947 under the title War as I Knew It is a significant document, but not a complete one. She removed passages she considered too inflammatory, too personal, or too politically sensitive for a readership still adjusting to the shape of the piece. The entry for September 1st, 1944, which in the unredacted original reads drove to Chartres, spoke to a French colonel who needed to be spoken to, returned by 12:45, ate cold beef and a tomato, wrote to be appears in the published version simply as Administrative Matters, Chartres area. She was protecting him. She was also in the way of people who love complicated men, protecting the version of him that she wanted the world to carry forward. She was not wrong to do it. She was not entirely right either. Beatrice Patton died in 1953, 8 years after her husband from a brain aneurysm suffered while riding her horse on the family estate in Massachusetts. She was 66 years old. She did not live to see the unredacted diaries released. She did not live to see Codman's memorandum become available to researchers. She did not live to see the story she had partially suppressed come back to the surface through the slow, patient work of archives and declassifications and an 83-year-old nurse in Pennsylvania who still had her diary. Colonel Charles Codman of Boston published his memoir drive in 1957. It is a graceful book, carefully observed, warmly written, full of Patton stories that illuminate the general's character without betraying the specific confidences he had been asked to keep. Chartres is not in it. When his daughter asked him why, he said, "Because the general asked me not to, and because the French still have feelings about it, and because I will be dead before they forget." He died in 1974. The memorandum he had sealed in the Boston Athenaeum was released to historians in 2003, 29 years after his death. He was right that he would not live to see it. He may have known he was right when he said it. That kind of careful man usually does. Sergeant John Mims of Abbeville, Alabama, drove George Patton to more places than any other human being on Earth during the European campaign, and spoke publicly about almost none of them. He returned to Alabama after the war, married Mary Lou, had 3 children, worked at a hardware store, and gave occasional interviews to military historians in which his standard answer to questions about specific dates was, "I drove the general to a lot of places. I didn't always know why." He did, though. He died in 1993. The letter he wrote to Mary Lou on September 2nd, 1944, the one that said drove the old man to a French town where some kind of fight was going on, and we are still fighting Germans. Mary Lou, I don't know why we are fighting. The French was deposited in the Mims family papers at Auburn University by his children in 1998, 5 years after his death. He had kept it for 49 years. He had not thrown it away. That is its own kind of testimony. Captain Wellborn Barton. Griffith Jr. of Quanah, Texas, was brought home in 1948 and buried in his hometown. His wife Willie had spent the 3 years since his death raising their daughter Carolyn alone in a small house in a small Texas city while working as a secretary at the county courthouse. Carolyn Griffith grew up knowing that her father had died in France, that he had done something brave in a cathedral, and that he was buried for several years in a field 4 miles east of the place where he died before the army brought him home. She grew up to become a schoolteacher. She taught 4th grade in Quanah for 31 years. She is by all accounts an exceptionally good teacher of the kind that students remember for the rest of their lives. She never met her father. She was 6 weeks old when he shipped out. There is no record that she ever visited Chartres or the plaque on the cathedral or the temporary cemetery east of the city where he lay for 4 years before coming home. There may be no reason she would want to. The plaque on the cathedral was paid for by the citizens of Chartres themselves in centimes, collected by subscription in 1954, 9 years after the war, because no government had done it, and the people of the city felt that something should mark the fact of what had happened. It is small. It is easy to miss. It says in French and English that an American officer gave his life to preserve this cathedral. It does not say his name prominently. It does not tell you about the 6-week-old daughter or the wife at the courthouse or the 4 years in a field east of town. It tells you the essential fact, which is that someone paid a price here, and that the price was real, and that the stone remembers it. My son, the principle that Patton defended in that 14-minute conversation has never been officially acknowledged by the French government. The report filed by Colonel Dupuy on September 3, 1944, remains classified by the French Ministry of the Armed Forces. Requests for its declassification have been denied on grounds of diplomatic precedent, which is a bureaucratic way of saying that acknowledging the document would require acknowledging what it describes, and acknowledging what it describes would require a conversation that no French government has yet been willing to have formally. The document exists. It is catalogued. The catalog entry is publicly available. The document itself is not. And yet, in 2014, in a folder marked simply Chartres, September 1944, the historian Olivier Viviorca found Koenig's draft. The draft that called Patton a Visigoth, and then admitted he was correct. The draft that said we are taking too much, we are thanking too little. The draft that asked de Gaulle for guidance, and received as far as the archive shows no reply. Viviorca published the translated passage in a footnote in a 2015 academic paper that appeared in a French historical journal with a circulation of approximately 4,000 subscribers. Almost no one read it. The footnote is 3 sentences long. It contains in 3 sentences the closest thing that exists to an official French acknowledgement that the argument Patton made in Chartres on September 1, 1944, was correct. A footnote in an academic paper, 60 years after the fact. That is the speed at which certain kinds of truth travel through official channels. But here is the thing about the truth that travels slowly through official channels. It travels faster everywhere else. The plaque in Chartres was paid for by civilians 9 years after the war. Mims kept his letter for 49 years and left it to his children, who gave it to a university. Nurse Krimmel kept her diary for 60 years and donated it to a presidential library. Codman sealed his memorandum and trusted that the seal would eventually be broken by someone who needed to know what was inside. These are not the actions of people who believe the story would be permanently lost. These are the actions of people who understood that certain things need to be held for a specific future moment, when the people who had reasons to suppress them were gone, and the people who had reasons to hear them were ready. That moment is now or close enough to now that the distinction does not matter. The unredacted Patton diaries have been available since 1996, Codman's memorandum since 2003, Krimel's diary since 2007, Villaviorca's footnote since 2015, the Mims letter since 1998, the State Department telegram since 1978. Piece by piece, the archive that four governments tried to keep fragmented has been assembling itself in plain sight, in presidential libraries and university collections, and academic footnotes waiting for someone to read all of it in the same sitting and understand what it adds up to. What it adds up to is this. A man drove 86 miles to say something true in a room where the truth was inconvenient. He said it in 14 minutes and 41 seconds. He said it for 291 dead Americans and one dead captain from Texas, and a 6-week-old daughter who would never know her father's face except from photographs. He said it knowing it would be suppressed, knowing it would cost him whatever diplomatic goodwill he had not already spent, knowing that the man he was indirectly addressing would write 3 volumes of memoirs and leave his name out of all of them. He said it anyway. Not because he thought it would change the official narrative. He was too experienced a man to believe that. He said it because someone in that room needed to have heard it, even if they never repeated it, even if the report was classified within 72 hours, even if the only record was a stopwatch and a leather notebook and the changing color of a French colonel's face. He said it because some lines need to be drawn even when no one is watching, especially when no one is watching. Because the line drawn in private, witnessed only by the people in the room and the dead in the field 4 miles east of town, is sometimes the only line that actually holds. Patton understood this. Koenig understood it in the draft he never sent. Krimel understood it writing in her diary the night she heard a dying general talk to himself in an empty room. Mims understood it, keeping a letter for 49 years because he felt without being able to articulate exactly why that it was not his to throw away. The people of Chartres understood it best of all. They did not wait for a government to tell them that a plaque was appropriate. They collected the money themselves. They installed it themselves. They wrote the words in 2 languages so that anyone who came to see the cathedral for whatever reason, walking past the famous rose windows and the carved portals and the labyrinth worn smooth by centuries of pilgrims' feet, might also see, if they looked carefully enough and were the kind of person who reads small bronze plaques in old stone buildings, that someone had been here before them, that someone had paid something, that the cost was real and the stone remembers, and the debt, wherever else it may have gone unacknowledged, was not here forgotten. From a general whom the War Department considered a national security risk, armed with ivory-handled revolvers and a stopwatch running in his aide's hand, to a 14-minute conversation that 3 governments spent 60 years erasing, and 1 archive spent 60 years preserving. This is the story of what it costs to say a true thing in a room full of people who have decided the true thing is inconvenient. Patton paid that cost. Griffith paid a different and larger one. The 291 paid the largest of all, in a currency that does not get refunded in a city of pale limestone and rose windows that is still standing because someone decided the building was worth dying for and the dead were worth speaking for. Bamni, some things the citizens remember even when the government forgets. And somewhere in a 4th-grade classroom in Quanah, Texas, a woman who never met her father is teaching children the thing that the plaque on the cathedral knows, and that the classified report in Paris will not say, and that a Visigoth general with pearl-handled revolvers said out loud in a building that smelled of cologne and cigarette smoke, and the particular arrogance of people who believe they have already written the ending that the cost of a thing is paid by the people who pay it, and it does not stop being paid just because no one is counting. Asterisk.